Welcome. In this talk, we're going to talk about the differences and the commonalities between feature flags and configuration options. Feature flags are a hot topic, especially in industry. There's a lot of discussion around this, and when talking to practitioners, we heard complaints and problems with them and whether we could help them. But they also seem very similar to configuration options, which have been researched for a long time in software product lines and configurable systems. So we wanted to understand differences more and try to explore this phenomenon closer. So what are feature flags? Essentially, they're just these Boolean conditions picking between two different code paths somewhere in the implementation. Here's an example where, depending on whether the option for show big checkout button is activated for a specific user, we show one or the other code path. And this is used for all kinds of things. It's very common for A/B experiments where you show different outputs to different users and see which one performs better. But it can also be used for Canary Releases where you incrementally roll out features to more and more users. And it's also very common for trunk-based development where you don't want feature branches, but you want all developers to commit code changes to the master branch. And then if you want to commit incomplete code changes or things that haven't been fully tested, you need to hide them from other developers to not interfere. So you use feature flags for this as well. And finally, feature flags are also used for some configuration decisions. So the previous study on feature flags that we found looked at Chrome and how they use feature flags in their development. And they actually reveal a number of feature flags as options to end users. If you find the setting, you can change quite a few experimental features. So feature flags are something that's very broadly discussed in blog posts and in comments and in talks at practitioner conference. And there are actually startups around this like LaunchDarkly and Split.io that essentially offer Boolean options as a service. But again, we wanted to understand what's actually happening here. And first we thought about studying this in open source, but this seems to be more an industry practice. We actually had a bet within the research team whether we would find any open source project beyond Chrome that would use feature flags. I lost that bet. We actually found quite a few, and we had an MSR paper about this, and I paid dinner for my colleagues. But we really wanted to understand this more, and especially with my background in software product lines and configurable systems, a lot here seemed really familiar. So for example, I've studied for many years a Linux kernel and its configuration option, which has thousands of configuration options at compile time and also more at runtime. There's been a lot of work on kind of studying this, analyzing this, documenting this, testing this kind of thing. So we wanted to understand how they are different. So our research question really is, what are the differences between feature flags and configuration options? What can we learn about them? With our background in configuration options, we were particularly interested in feature flags. So we studied gray literature and also talked to quite a few developers in industry who develop frameworks for this, who use feature flags and so on to learn more. In our paper, we have lots of differences in discussions and structure this based on what we're finding. I just want to show you a few highlights. First of all, we found different goals of using feature flags. The ones I've shown you earlier, trunk-based development, experimental code paths, and configuration decisions. And we think it's worth to distinguish these as groups because they are used for quite different things. Some feature flags are used for configuration options, and they're actually quite similar to traditional notions of configurable systems and configuration options. But other feature flags for trunk-based development, A/B testing, and Canary Releases are quite different. They usually don't have a long lifespan, or they're not intended to. The developers are in control, or operators are in control of using them. And there are lots of differences when it comes to managing them, thinking about them, and tooling about them that we think, and we have several of these recommendations, but we think clearly labeling the goal and distinguishing different kinds of flags is actually really beneficial. The lifespan is actually one of the key distinguishing characteristics here, and something that's new compared to the product line world. In product lines, we have essentially given up ever getting rid of features. Some end users might still use them. We might want to use them later. It's very rare that you see them removed. For feature flags, a lot of people at least still have hope and push for this and discuss this as technical debt. And there's actually mechanisms and lots of opportunities to really document expectations about lifetime and conditions and have some tooling and some automation in the process. Actually, speaking briefly again about our other paper, we found that flag ownership actually corresponds to shorter lifespan. So I think there's lots of opportunity to study good practices here. But at the same time, I think there's also lots of things that we can learn from configurable systems for the feature flag community. For example, the product line community has developed a lot of formalisms about describing options and their dependencies and documenting them, feature models and things like this. Here's an excerpt from the Linux kernel. And I think this is something that the feature flag community often ignores. And several of our interviews talked about possible opportunities for improvement there. Also, there are lots of analysis techniques in the research literature on configurable systems, for example, tracking options through the source code, which might also help with removing them and understanding their impact and testing them. And also for testing, there's a lot of work like combinatorial testing, which surprisingly none of our interviewees was familiar with, which is a very powerful technique with very few configurations to test interactions among many options. And I think there's a lot of potential here to explore some of these mechanisms to try them also for feature flags. So in general, we looked at feature flags and configuration options, and we found that they're clearly not the same. They're clearly distinguishing differences, and we should not just equate them and use the same tools for both of them. But I think there's also a lot of potential for transfer of knowledge and tools between these two communities. We're not saying that you should just adopt the configuration option tools or the feature flag tools for everything, but there are clearly differences and commonalities here and opportunities for sharing. And you find more examples of this in the paper together with interview results and 8 of our recommendations. Thanks.